This morning, we are going to share some reflections from the past several months of our Tuesdays at 2 conversation group. It has been an amazing journey, and we'd like to offer our experiences as a small group. Little did I know that by offering a time to talk during COVID at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays, which quite selfishly was more for me to reach out and have people to talk to amidst this time of isolation, that God would open this door and take us on an amazing journey, a journey which provided the opportunity for sacred conversations focused on systemic racism and oppression and abuse of people of color in our country. And as our group journeyed together, we felt that we had something to share and to offer. And so at this time, I'd like to invite Ruth Wilbanks to share her reflection on our time together.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Ruth Wilbanks, and just so you know a little about me and how I came to this, I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, in a predominantly white upper middle class neighborhood. Growing up, I had friends and a few classmates of different races and ethnicities. Not many in elementary school, but more as I got older. And then once I started working, I had many colleagues who were people of color. I thought I was pretty well-rounded and broad-minded. I would soon learn that there was so much I just hadn't seen. Our Tuesdays at 2 discussions started out, as Reverend Beth said, as a way just to stay connected during the pandemic, but it grew into so much more. We started out in early May with no set agenda, just discussing daily routines and canceled vacation plans, and generally just checking in with one another. Then on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered. And a week later, Donald Trump cleared peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square so that he could stand in front of St. John's Church holding a Bible for a photo op. Suddenly, we had a lot more to talk about. We began to discuss the scourge of racism in our country and in our daily lives. We quickly realized that we all had a lot to learn, so we looked for ways to educate ourselves and discovered the Bexley Anti-Racism Project's 21-Day Challenge. Over the next 2 months, we discussed films and podcasts and articles. There was so much I didn't know. I felt sorrow, anger, and shame for what my brothers and sisters had suffered and for the harm that we were continuing to spread. I was guilty of not recognizing the privilege that my whiteness had given me. I wished I could do better. The Sacred Ground 10-week discussion program also consisted of films and readings. Personally, I found it a little clunkier to use, but still a valuable resource, and again, so much information that I hadn't previously considered. While the 21-Day Challenge focused primarily on African Americans, the Sacred Ground program included units devoted to Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and other immigrant groups and class divisions. Our Tuesday group of 7 held many common beliefs, but we also learned that our past experiences were quite different at times. Our discussions were emotional and honest. Yes, I still feel regret that I grew up with so much ignorance about race, but I also feel hopeful because I know that I am not alone. The people in the group all supported each other and did not judge. What started out as a way to simply stay connected during a pandemic became a true connection of people of faith, holding each other in our hearts and in our prayers, admitting our ignorance and eager to learn more. And I would like to turn this over to another participant, Mark Brown.
Where's that move button? Thank you, Ruth. So I was participating in the discussion group that was struggling with issues of race and faith. We started with films and readings in the 21-Day Anti-Racism Challenge and continued with the Episcopal Church's Sacred Ground. This journey has been enlightening, to say the least, and so were the painful truths revealed. I considered myself colorblind and strove to treat all persons equally. I have traveled the world and been exposed to many cultures, peoples, and faiths. I thought I was one of the good guys when it came to racism. But I was completely blind to my own white privilege. Growing up in a white middle-class American household in Florida meant I had all of the advantages of education, employment, and opportunities so often denied of persons of color. I just didn't see it. This journey has educated me in the systemic racism in America that began with the founding of our country, the subjugation of First Nations people and the theft of their land, enslavement of Africans with the full support of the church, continued oppression of Blacks after emancipation, and the oppression of Asian and Mexican minorities who helped open the American West. This systemic racism continues to this day with mass incarceration of people of color, primarily Blacks, police brutality and murder of minority, again, primarily Blacks, discrimination in education, employment, real estate, healthcare, and financial opportunities. The list goes on and on. Change is desperately needed, and it starts with education. I'd now like to turn it over to Audrey Thompson.
Thank you, Mark. In order to help you better understand my perspective as a participant of the course, I should tell you I was born and schooled in Jamaica and came to this country as an adult, where I continued my education. I spent about 7 of my adult years in England. I am now a naturalized American who has been living and working here for about 40 years. The course brings the subject of racism, that's the Sacred Ground course, brings the subject of racism and white privilege forcibly into one's consciousness, resulting in a sensitivity to the subject for both Caucasians and people of color. Using a miscellany of sources, films, articles, and books, the course also attempts to explain efforts made and being made to remedy the effects of the disease of racial prejudice, particularly against people of color, Blacks, Native Americans, and Latinos. More poignantly, the course addresses the acknowledgement of the perpetuation of slavery by the church and other religious organizations, and the efforts of the Episcopal Church to atone for and repair the breach. As a person of color who participated in the course alongside 4 Caucasians and 2 other persons of color, I feel I now have a better understanding of how greed and cowardice may have motivated white privilege to inflict such inhumane treatment on slaves and other people of color. I appreciate the efforts made towards reparation by the church and others. I believe that acts of physical reparation may prove valuable to victims of racism and slavery in particular, especially the very young. For myself, I would prefer only to be treated with respect, dignity, and equality. I would like when others look at me, they see beyond the color of my skin to my true character. As the saying goes, do not judge a book by its cover. In order to understand the story, one must read the book. That is, take the time to get to the heart of it. Thank you. I turn over to Linda Lightfoot.
Thank you, Audrey, and good morning to everyone. I grew up in a segregated community in New England, in New Haven, Connecticut. My family and the Black community both protected, supported, and inspired me during these formative years. During my adult life, I experienced and witnessed various degrees of discrimination and racism. The perspectives I brought to the group were based on this background. The weekly meetings provided relief from watching a perfect storm that continues throughout our country. The storm is the battleground of injustices and hateful actions against individuals, groups, and communities. From a framework of Christianity, we faced and discussed the ugly truth of racism and its pervasiveness in our society. We reviewed movies, films, documentaries, and writings. Most importantly, we reflected on our own experiences and shared our heartfelt thoughts and feelings about what we expected of ourselves and others. Regardless of our backgrounds or ethnicities, we all recognize the need for work to be done by all. Through our discussions and sharing, we were working towards what the Episcopal Church refers to as the beloved community. Growth in knowledge, understanding, and empathy comes with commitment and hard work. This was just the beginning of work to be done. I remain committed and hopeful. I now turn this over to Carolyn Dybel.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning to everyone. When Reverend Beth set up a Tuesday Zoom meeting for our congregation, I welcomed the opportunity to join with parishioners to connect socially and emotionally and to share my concerns and feelings about the pandemic. Early on, after the killing of George Floyd, we all were moved instead to use our platform for a discussion of police violence and protests, mainly concerning Blacks and people of color. Eventually, this expanded to other races as well. As our study progressed, it became clear that we needed to examine our own personal histories. In my childhood, I don't think I was taught to hate the Negro population, as they were called then, but more to think of it as a status quo situation. Negroes were portrayed to me as generally poor and living in poverty-stricken areas in big cities, which we were advised to avoid. As a sixth grader, I remember taking a bus to lessons with my first piano teacher, Mr. Fisher, way across Rochester, New York, after school. The bus route went through a predominantly Black neighborhood. As I looked out the window, I wondered why the residents lived so differently from me. Sure, I learned about slavery in school, but never connected it to the oppressive lives Negroes were enduring so many years later. In school, I had several Black friends, mostly in junior high school and senior high school. I don't recall any particular racism, but now I realize it's possible that I was blind to it. In my yearbooks, there are only a handful of Black students, so it's obvious that I definitely grew up in predominantly white communities. As I look at one of few portraits of Black faces on those pages, I now wonder how those students must have felt trying to fit in. This is only one of many examples of how this study group has enlightened me. As a young adult, I became aware of civil rights and was appalled by the treatment of Black protesters, first in the South and eventually in the North, which I viewed on TV newscasts. In college, apartheid became a reality through student demonstrations and cries for our institution to divest some of its financial business in South Africa. Well into my adulthood, I continued to believe in that status quo theory from childhood, which still seemed evident in many urban areas. But I also observed that was not the reality for all Black people. These two scenarios were confusing, yet I didn't know how to start a conversation to try to understand the situation better. Over the last couple of years, there were discussion groups at the cathedral, which sounded interesting. And as I heard constant reports of many minority citizens who were being killed by police, I started wondering why that was often the tragic outcome for such small offenses, or even for no legal offense at all. All these life experiences combined have helped to lay the groundwork for my eagerness to learn more about how to fight racism. The first assignments Beth gave us were at times eye-opening, shocking, sad, disgusting, and frustrating. At first, I could only respond with emotion, disbelief, and sympathy as I became aware of how my white race had been and continues to be complicit in the substandard treatment of minorities. That really caused me to reflect on my own personal history. I think what has most enlightened me during this study is learning about the true history of slavery and how similar practices today in our society are extensions of that and perpetuate it. I've started to realize the importance and urgency of learning the real history and how it permeates our daily lives. In fact, I now notice how much discussion of this topic is occurring in the media almost daily, and how many publications on the subject have been out there for years. Now, I believe we need to share this awakening with our friends and family and ultimately our community. I was fortunate to have my daughter living with me when this group formed. Since she was beginning to explore this herself, we watched a lot of media productions together and shared our ideas and concerns. I was grateful to have her support, as I know it's not always easy to start this conversation. My end feeling is how much needs to be done in the long road ahead. However, despite all I've seen, heard, and read, I feel relieved and grateful, even happy, that I've had this opportunity to at least begin to delve into the history of racial injustice in America and the world, and how it might be addressed today. I am convinced that we all need to do that to help us become a more unified nation. And now we will hear from John Lightfoot.
Thank you, Carolyn. A little bit about myself. I was baptized in the Episcopal Church at the age of 2. I grew up in Washington, D.C. during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and I went to college in Boston, Massachusetts. My 35 plus years of work consisted of service in the United States Army and the United States government. My experiences during these times in my life formed some of the feelings and thoughts that I felt I could express in our Tuesday meetings. When I consider what I have taken from our Tuesday sessions over the past few months, several thoughts come to mind. First, I am glad to be part of the Episcopal faith that has made a commitment towards racial healing and justice in the church, communities, and our society. In sacred ground, the church has developed a tool that can be used to start reaching for those goals. Second, I thank Reverend Beth for employing sacred ground as a means for St. Nicholas to be active in the challenge to become the beloved community. The sessions have created an atmosphere where I have not been reluctant to relate personal experiences of racial prejudice and discrimination. I have been comfortable doing this with the confidence that others would not feel they were being attacked or accused, but would listen and understand. That is a good start towards becoming a beloved community. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the participants of our Tuesdays at 2 group. Again, God opened a door and opportunities presented themselves. And I want to urge everyone that's here and listening to take advantage when we send out the sermon or the reflection as we do on Monday. We will also have a list of the resources that we feel might bring a start to some learning and to some understanding. You've heard people say that they felt they were colorblind, or they felt that they had no concerns about racism, but I assure you that we all do. And we as a group, and I as your priest, am deeply committed to helping us along this journey of self-discovery and of healing as a beloved community to be the people that God has offered and wants us to be. I just want to add in closing that I'm most grateful for the sacred conversations that we had during these sessions, for all of our sharing and all of the revelations that we experienced. And as this group has said, and as I endorse, we are all deeply committed to expanding these conversations and learnings so that we become more and more the beloved community where everyone is valued and no one is on the margins. We are pledging to use our voice, our vote, our privilege to end and address systemic racism in our families, our communities, and in our country. As the words that were spoken by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King remind us, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I pray that we find the light, learn about our past and our own biases, and become the light to shine forth God's love, God's healing, and God's justice in our world today. Amen.